And now to create the outer shell of the skirt before inserting the lining. Starting with the fronts, I'm measuring from center front to the edge to make sure I know exactly what that first fold amount is. The fabric was folded with the wrong sides inside this time, so I'm starting with the right side down and folding the facing in. And now creating the second fold, this will create interfacing inside the facing. So this skirt is self-faced and self-interfaced. If you noticed the white chalk mark, it's to indicate the wrong side of the fabric. And repeating the same process on the other front piece. I want to make sure that my markings for setting the pocket on are very, very clear on the pattern. And then I can transfer these dimensions or markings to the skirt so that the two pockets are aligned correctly. The top of the pocket rests 1.5 inches from the bottom of the waistband area. And now by aligning the pattern piece, I can put straight pins straight through the pattern and pull them through the paper to help me align the pockets. Double checking from the edge of the skirt over to the pins. They should be the exact same amount. The top pin and the bottom pin, the same distance from the edge of the fabric to the pin should be exactly the same. In other words, the pocket will be parallel to the front edge of the skirt. Now to work on the pockets. As you can see, there's a little chalk mark at the bottom of the pocket that indicates wrong side of the fabric. And the pocket facings. Putting right sides together. This is cotton batiste, and it's the exact same shape and size as the facing. It will be used as an interfacing. Now I'm going to baste these together. You can use a normal stitch or a basting stitch. And staying within the 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to zigzag the outside of the facing to finish the edge. That's the side that the hand doesn't go in, as you'll see in a moment when I lay these on top of the pockets. You could also call it the bottom edge of the facing. Trimming off the excess white cotton. Facings can be tricky because one side looks fairly similar to the other, and it's easy to sew them with the wrong orientation, so I keep checking to make sure I'm sewing them correctly. What I'm doing here is sewing the edge where the seam allowance is, so I have a hard edge to follow to press under. Normally, of course, this would be done with matching thread, but again, for teaching purposes, it makes sense to use a contrasting thread. I do this on lots of hems. And this is, in a way, a hem because it's turned under and stitched. By having that stitching line, it gives me a nice hard guideline. It's actually, you can feel it, see it, and it helps create a straight line when you turn it under and press it. If I didn't have this stitched line, it would be much more difficult to turn the 1/2 inch under evenly all the way across. And now to apply the facings. Checking my seam allowances. First, I'm sewing across the very top of the pocket. This was a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And now down the curved area, and that is for the hand entry. This is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Notice I didn't turn the pocket and go up that diagonal straight line. That will be sewn into the side seam of the skirt. Trimming the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top and cutting a diagonal where the 2 seam allowances intersect to get rid of some of the bulk. Pressing it flat to embed the stitches. And clipping the curve. I'm clipping pretty close. I clipped about 1/2 an inch to 3/4 of an inch apart, plus I clipped almost to the seam and pressing this open. The straight seam allowance at the top of the pocket, I'm putting on this wonderful pressing tool. This is good for collars and all kinds of points. And wood, of course, absorbs moisture, so that's why these tools are wood. This is really good for getting in those little corners. This is a wooden point turner. You can use your scissors, but you have to be really careful not to poke a hole through the fabrics, which can easily happen with scissors. And I'm rolling the seam in just a fraction so it doesn't show from the outside. In other words, the seam line is not centered on the edge of the fabric. It rolls in just a fraction, trimming off some of the interfacing that still shows. Clipping the curve. Clipping the corner diagonally. Embedding the stitches. Pressing the seam open. Clipping where this curve becomes a straight line so it will turn nicely. If you don't clip curves and then turn the fabric right side out, it will never press correctly. It will always be bumpy, it won't lay flat. This is the orientation of the pocket on the front skirt piece. I'm lining up the actual stitching line. Parallel to the front edge. You could also create a chalk line, but sometimes chalk's very messy, so I prefer to do it with the straight pins. Now you can see it's parallel to the front edge. Checking again and again and again to make sure it's very straight. Now you can see that they look the same. And now to stitch down that particular line that I just pinned. And this, of course, is at 1/2 inch seam allowance and a normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch, or whatever you determine is the best stitch length for your fabric. As you can see, I'm stitching right next to that stitching line that helped me fold the fabric and press it under. This way, the original, the first stitching line, won't show when I flip the pocket out so that it's right side up on the skirt. I'm trimming the seam allowance because it will be top stitched, and the way I top stitch it will encase that raw seam allowance inside the top stitching. And trim that to about 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch. And you see on the very left how the curve sticks away from the skirt. That will be pulled in, and that makes that stand away from the skirt to help the hand go into the pocket. It gives you a little extra room. Remembering to trim the bottom seam allowance in the same manner as I did the vertical seam allowance. I have forgotten to do the top stitching around the curve. So fortunately, I'm remembering before I finalize all the sewing of the pocket onto the skirt. So I'm actually starting at the bottom of the curve and working up. Either way, of course, would be fine. And it would have been easier if I had done this before I started sewing the pocket to the skirt. But so far, there's no problem. This is sewn at 1/4 inch seam allowance, top stitching, and normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch. Now coming up to the top of the pocket where that short right angle is, I'm going to leave a long thread and pull it through and tie it off, because this will be shown from the outside of the skirt and I don't want any back tacking to show or any knots to show. So I'm pulling it through and tying it off. At the bottom of the curve, that will be sewn into the seam allowance at the side seams, so you can just leave that as it is. Pulling that little corner in to match the side seam. First I'm trimming off the excess interfacing, but you see again how it sticks out a little bit, so pull it up to the edge of the side seam and that gives you that little extra amount standing away from the skirt to allow the hand to go in very easily. Now I'm going to top stitch the pocket down. I want a long tail of thread so that I can pull it through and tie it off on the other side rather than back tack. To turn the corner, embed your needle, turn the fabric, and continue stitching. Now this seam was originally stitched before the top stitching. The pocket was stitched down to the garment. So when I turn the bottom, as I'm turning it now, the bottom part of that pocket, you want to make sure that your top stitching encases the seam. So the inside seam, you can't trim it too much or it will pull away from the top stitching. And now just to stabilize the pocket onto the skirt at the side seam, I'm going to stitch it down. You could do it with basting stitches or regular stitches. It doesn't matter which. Bring the thread through to the other side with a needle and tie it off. Repeat the same process on the other side. Trimming the seam allowance, and the bottom seam allowance, but not so much that the top stitching won't be able to grab it. Using a press cloth so I can put the iron with a lot of pressure against that seam. If I don't use the press cloth, the iron may create a shine. It doesn't if I let the iron float above the fabric and just steam it, but sometimes irons will create a shine on fabric that you can't get out. Pulling that little extended corner in. Making sure that the side seams and pockets, the pocket orientation is the same on both pieces. There, pulling it in and securing it with a straight pin. and top stitching the pocket down. Sorry you can't see this. I'm tacking the edge down. You'll see in a moment. What I did was, at the very top, that small edge of the pocket, I just reinforced the seam allowance through all except the very outside layer. As you see now, I'm weaving it in and out because the seam allowance at the very top is top stitched, but above that, where it's rolled and pressed, it could roll down with wear. So I've just secured that very top line. And now to stabilize the side seam along the pocket edge to hold it together. See how it's flopping back and forth? That's what I did on the first one, and I'll do it on this one as well. I'm sewing it from behind. You can do it with a running stitch in and out or a little cross stitch, whatever works, just to secure that very top rolled and pressed under edge down. There, this one's a little easier to see. I'm just pulling the needle in and out, making sure I don't go completely through all layers. I'm catching the seam allowance to the skirt. and securing that corner. Going back over it just to make it nice and stable. And now my pockets are done. For a final press using the press cloth. And now to work with the back of the skirt pattern and fabric to put the skirt side seams together. Right sides together. Matching notches and pinning the side seams face or right sides together. Stitching with a normal seam, and it's a 3/4 inch seam allowance. And repeating the same process with the other side seams. not quite as straight as I wish it would be. So I'll go over that seam and take out the stitches I don't like. And pressing the seam open. What I'm doing is taking the row of stitching out that stabilized the pocket to the side seam before I sewed the front and back together. If I think of this another time, I'll just loosely baste it by hand. The reason I'm taking the stitching out is that normally you would press this seam completely open, but that extra layer of pocket, if it's pressed open, will be bulky. So I want it to go to the back, as you will see in a moment. I want that seam allowance of the pocket to face the back of the skirt. Now it will lay so much nicer when it's on the body. It won't have a lot of bulk at the hip line. By breaking every stitch about maybe half an inch apart, 3/8 with the seam ripper, then go to the other side and pull, and the stitches will come out very easily. You can see at the pocket, right where my hands are, how the seam rolls a little. I want that to be super flat. So using the press cloth and a lot of pressure with the iron, and as you see with my left hand, I'm pulling the fabric a little. That helps to flatten it.